Hey y'all, and welcome back to Flick Connection, where in less time than you typically spend scrolling for something to watch every night, I'm going to tell you about 20 hidden gem movies currently free to watch on Tubi. Hidden gems, underrated movies, whatever you want to call it, these are going to be 20 movies that you've likely either never heard of at all or have likely passed on more than once. Thanks to Sundays for Dogs for sponsoring this video. We'll talk more about them in a bit, but for now, let's start with my number 20 pick, which is a sexy one, Deception. Now this actually stars Hugh Jackman in a very unusual role for him and Ewan McGregor. Michelle Williams also stars in this, and this is not a very well-reviewed movie, or at least it was panned a little bit back when it was originally released, and it's because it tries to go for like a Fatal Attraction type of a movie, you know, things like Basic Instinct, and while it doesn't quite hold up to those, it is filled with twists and turns. Some you can see coming, some you can't, but that's why it's far back on this list. If you like sexy thrillers though, Deception is a surprisingly good one. Speaking of sexy, Juno Temple stars in my next pick, and she's fantastic in it, The Brass Teapot.
I'm so sorry for this, John. Look, it gives you money when you hurt yourself.
Now this one has a simple setup, but it's an interesting one. A young couple comes into the possession of a magical brass teapot. The more they are hurt, the more money comes pouring out of this thing. So the movie quickly becomes this exercise in ways to harm yourself that are non-permanent. You know, ways you could earn money without actually losing a limb, let's say. But obviously a teapot like that would be highly valuable and sought after, and so some folks come looking for it. This is just a cool little indie flick. You got a couple of great performances and again, an interesting idea that's just well delivered for an indie flick. Now, my number 18 pick is also an indie flick. There's a lot of them on this list, but this one is for a very select group of you watching. It's going to be people who love weird movies, but also enjoy art house films that maybe lack a bit of direction. Now, She Dies Tomorrow is a very interesting flick, but it's not really glued together well at all. And in fact, it doesn't even seem as if they attempted to glue this thing together. It just sort of happens. And I'm being cryptic for a reason. I can't really explain what the movie's about, but if you're often disappointed in sort of the directionless way that some art house films like this can go, then this one's going to make you upset. But if you like new and interesting things you've never seen before, She Dies Tomorrow is definitely that. But for something a bit more fun, we're going to go with an action movie from Scott Adkins. I've recommended his movies a bunch over the years, and while Accident Man is not my favorite movie he's done, it is a lot of fun.
How the bloody hell do I make this look like an accident?
I tend to be a fan of his more badass movies like Avengement, but Accident Man is actually a little bit more like the classic flick The Mechanic. Because in this movie, Scott Adkins plays a hitman who makes things look like accidents. The thing that is so fun about Accident Man, though, is he's part of this elite group of assassins, you know, kind of like John Wick, but it's a revenge movie, so he has to take down a bunch of these cartoonish assassins. And that's what this movie is, a cartoonish version of like a John Wick or The Mechanic. Meaning, if you don't typically like those movies, this one's not a total banger, but if you do, then this is just a fun comedy with a similar plot line. Now, another fun comedy with a plot line that's similar to things you've seen before is Bad Milo.
What is it?
You got a thing in your butt.
But this one doesn't have anything in common with anything else on this list. No, this is a comedy based on a very specific type of creature feature. Think movies like Basket Case, Brain Damage, Society, The Reanimator. If you like things like that, then Bad Milo is a more current but absolutely hilarious version. You follow a very stressed out man who learns he's got something deep inside of him that is just begging to come out, and it's this gross little clawed creature named Milo. The movie is as gross as it sounds, but it's also as funny as it sounds. This is another one. If you typically like those creature feature movies I mentioned, then Bad Milo is an excellent spoof on those movies, but if you've never seen some of those movies I mentioned, I imagine a lot of the comedy in Bad Milo is going to be lost on you. Okay, now my next one will appeal to people who enjoy bad Milo and will not appeal to anyone who's easily disgusted. All right, my next pick is titled Teeth, and it's about a woman who has teeth. They're in her vagina. As if that's not gross enough, not only are they teeth, but they're razor sharp. Now the movie itself, while it does have some gore, it's not overly gory, or at least it's not, excuse me, when it's gory, it's pretty gross, as you can imagine, but it's not pervasive through the whole thing. Now, this has turned into a cult classic of a movie, and it does have quite a lot to say. Obviously, the setup here is pretty simple, but this is also a girl who, participates in the whole chastity ring thing. So there's actually quite a bit of story, but as you can imagine, aside from the teeth part, there's also some disgusting behavior on behalf of most of the men in this movie as well. But props to this movie for just going for it. I mean, if they had just held this thing back, it still would have been a weird movie, but it wouldn't have been worth much. As it stands, they did not hold back really seemingly at all, and the movie's actually worth quite a bit. It makes you think a little bit, plus it's just kind of a wild cult movie about a woman with some teeth in her. Yeah. Now my next pick proves that not all remakes are created equal. The 1994 remake to the Steve McQueen classic The Getaway is a fantastic flick that also stars a fairly young Alec Baldwin and Kim Basinger, but you've also got James Woods, Michael Madsen doing a really great character, and Jennifer Tilly. This too is kind of a sexy movie at times. It can even be a little bit repulsive at times with the sex stuff, but it's an adult movie about criminals on the lam trying to get away from the man. And it's not just a road movie. It reminded me a little bit of the flick California with a K starring Brad Pitt, but it follows the storyline of the Steve McQueen original, and while that is a good movie, they did such a banging job with the remake that this 1994 flick has got style that still feels somewhat relevant, and it's a cool watch, especially for free on Tubi this month. But for another getaway type of a movie with a bunch of stars in it, we've got Runaway Jury. Now this is based on a book by John Grisham that actually did not take place in New Orleans. They just filmed it there because it's a little more cinematic than South Mississippi, where the book actually takes place, which is where I'm from, incidentally. So that gives me a little bit of a connection to this movie or even the book, but Runaway Jury is actually a fantastic thriller. It's got a lot of twists and turns, some that you will see coming just because you've seen them in other movies that have been made since. But there's so many in this movie, you're not going to catch them all. The movie also does a great job of showing you the inner workings of jury selection. Again, something you've probably seen before, but the movie goes in depth, but it also goes into depth of jury manipulation. And as if all of that were not interesting enough, it's actually a pretty stellar story. Again, you're talking John Grisham. It's not the best movie ever adapted from a John Grisham book, but it is a solid one that just hasn't held up with time the way it probably could have. But I do have a few action movies on this list. In fact, Tubi has a bunch of amazing action movies right now, but next up on the list, we've got a Bruce Willis cult classic that also stars folks like Christopher Walken in Last Man Standing. Now, even though this does take place in the West, it is much more of a gangster movie. It actually takes place in the 1920s, which technically makes it a gangster movie remake of the Western, A Fistful of Dollars, which is an American Western remake of the Japanese film Yojimbo. So it's got classic revenge movie stuff, but the gangster politics of Last Man Standing kind of help set it apart. It's also a crazy, wild shoot-'em-up movies, and this was before filmmakers were really keen on counting rounds. So if you're one of those folks that likes to pick apart all the gunplay in movies for inaccuracies, Last Man Standing is loaded with them. Then my number 11 pick is foreign language. You are going to have to read subtitles, but this is the first feature film from director Nicholas Winding Refn, who's probably most famous for Drive with Ryan Gosling, but he also did Bronson with Tom Hardy, Valhalla Rising, The Neon Demon. Pusher actually stars Mads Mikkelsen as a drug pusher who gets into debt, owes someone a lot of money in a very short amount of time. This too is a plot you've seen before, but this is Mads Mikkelsen in 1996, directed by Nicholas Winding Refn. It's a badass drug movie. Tubi also has Pusher 2 and Pusher 3. Pusher 3 being a movie I've actually never seen. But speaking of pushers, it's time for me to push today's sponsor, which is kind of an amazing thing for dog lovers, Sundays for Dogs. And that's because Sundays actually extended the life of our dog, Peanut. Sundays is premium, air-dried dog food that's made of 90% human-grade meat, meaning meat that's safe for you and I to eat. The other 10% is vegetables with no synthetic ingredients. As Peanut got older, she suddenly, out of nowhere, stopped digesting the food that we've been giving her for years, food that we thought was good and healthy food, and she began to waste away as a result, but switching her diet to Sundays changed everything. Not only did she seem to love the taste, but she was putting weight back on almost immediately, and we now know we were giving her better nutrition than we were giving her with that basic grocery store food. But because Sundays is air-dried, it is shelf-stable. You don't have any messy prep or cleanup with this stuff. It's literally like dried kibble. You just drop it in the bowl and they gobble it up. It's not gonna stink in your fridge. And Sundays can actually help you save money. Because they're not spending money on refrigeration costs, ice packs to get it to your door, they pass the savings on to you and they're only focused on this short list of premium ingredients. Sundays can cost up to 40% less than other fresh dog food brands, but for a limited time, my viewers are gonna save an additional 50% off on top of that when they go to the link in the video description below, or just go to sundaysfordogs.com and use my code FLICK. Again, that's 50% off, an already great price. It comes straight to your door. No grocery shopping, no prep, cleanup, none of that. And it saves you money and gives your dog the better nutrition that they need. It's a great deal. Again, to get it, use my link in the video description below, or just go to sundaysfordogs.com and use my code FLICK when you check out to get that 50% discount. But speaking of great stuff, let's talk about the top 10 movies on this list. My man Martin Scorsese makes the list with one of his lesser-known movies. It also happens to be one of his most fun movies, maybe second to The Wolf of Wall Street. We've got After Hours. Now, admittedly, this one does not feel like a Martin Scorsese movie, hardly at all. In fact, this was originally slated to be Tim Burton's first feature film. He actually backed away when he heard Martin Scorsese was interested in it. He then went on to direct Pee-wee's Big Adventure as his first movie. But After Hours follows one man's adventure in Manhattan over one night. He tries to go out, meet a nice woman. At some point, he thinks he's successful with this, and boy, is he wrong. Like a lot of Scorsese movies, it feels fairly plotless. I mean, you really are just following one man who's just trying to not have a terrible night in Manhattan, and it's just not working out for him. Even though the dialogue and the banter doesn't feel like Curb Your Enthusiasm, I do think if you love Curb Your Enthusiasm, there's a lot to enjoy with the misery that this man endures over one night. I mean, that is where a lot of the comedy comes from. It is cringe humor, but it's also cringe humor directed by Martin Scorsese, and it's very unique in that sense. I did promise some action on this list, and next up we've got our real badass Schwarzenegger flick that just never gets enough love, Raw Deal. Now this too ends up being a gangster movie. He's actually an undercover cop in this movie, and it's got some wacky stuff in it. I mean, he's married to a real bear of a woman that's throwing chocolate cake at him. There's a weird chase sequence in the beginning that's a lot of fun to watch, and then you ultimately get Arnold Schwarzenegger just being an absolute badass. He's all slick with the suit. Later, he's busting out the leather jacket. I mean, it is quintessential Schwarzenegger, but this is 1986, so it's right between The Terminator and Predator. It has fairly low ratings because it is a silly movie, but so is Commando, and that movie is just beloved and highly rated because it goes into such a wild and ridiculous direction. Raw Deal does the same thing, it just didn't go quite as hard, so it has not held up as a cult classic, even though it definitely should have been. Alright, next up, we've got a little known movie also from one of the most revered directors of all time, Woody Allen. But this time, we've got a movie titled Match Point that is much more like an Alfred Hitchcock flick than it is a Woody Allen movie. In fact, I don't know that there's a single laugh through the entirety of this movie, and it's fairly slow paced. You have to wait quite a while for this movie to pop off, but once it does, it's kind of a stunner. This too turns into kind of a sexy thriller. You've got a fairly young Scarlett Johansson who begins to have an affair with a man that eventually determines he can't afford to be the kind of a man who's had an affair. And things actually go into a surprisingly dark direction for a Woody Allen movie. Now, it's not the only movie he's done like this, but it's definitely my favorite out of the dark thrillers he's tried to do. Real quick, if you like getting movie recommendations like this, definitely consider clicking the subscribe button, maybe even the like button, or even a comment. Those are all great ways to let the algorithm know you'd like to see more content like this again in the future. My number 7 pick is another art house flick that is just not going to appeal to people who don't like weird art house movies, but Border is actually a movie about a couple of trolls. But they're actually just odd-looking people existing in the world among us. So Border's technically a fantasy movie, yet it feels very grounded, like it's actually happening in our reality. So the metaphor is kind of clear just from the setup, but then the story you go on with this main, I guess we'll say female character. I don't know that I want to call her a woman since she's a troll. But the story here is actually quite touching at times, but it too goes into a surprisingly dark direction. Not one that's going to necessarily turn you off, it's not that dark, but it goes there and it's pretty impactful. Speaking of impact, I'll also say there is a troll sex scene in this movie that's beyond bizarre, so just be ready for that. Tubi also currently has what we'll call the now Paul Walker cult classic, Running Scared, a movie I've highly recommended on this channel for years. I love that flick, and if you love it too, then you'll remember there are a bunch of references to the John Wayne movie, The Cowboys, which is currently also available on Tubi. Now, this is one I've owned. I grew up on this movie, and I honestly have not seen it included on a streaming service either in a long time or possibly ever. This is an amazing John Wayne movie, even for people who don't think they like John Wayne or don't really know that much about John Wayne. It's very accessible. He's got to take a group of very young boys, in fact some of them are incredibly young, like in the single digits. He's got to take them on a cattle drive, and this film does an amazing job of showing you how difficult a cattle drive can actually be, especially for an older movie. This is a pretty rough and tumble flick. It also features one of the greatest roles from Bruce Dern's long career. He's a bad guy in this, and he absolutely kills it. This role, I think, is the reason he's still in movies today. Next up, we've got what is technically like an action vampire flick from the 90s titled Near Dark.
It's finger licking good.
This is actually directed by Catherine Bigelow. She's most famous for Point Break, but also winning an Academy Award for The Hurt Locker. So she's known for some pretty badass movies, and Near Dark is definitely one of them. Near Dark actually revolves around a traveling group of vampires. They've got this camper with the windows blacked out. Bill Paxton has a cool role in this, and for a vampire movie from the late 80s, it's surprisingly cinematic. So it's got a great look to it, and it's just a must-watch for vampire movie lovers. If you've somehow never seen this, Jim, make it the first one you watch off of this list. I'm telling you, classics like The Lost Boys, if you love that stuff, you need to see Near Dark soon. And then for my number 4 pick, we've got a thriller from South Korea that is just second to none, Sympathy for Mr. Vengeance. This is from director Park Chan-wook, who also did Old Boy and The Handmaiden. And even though I think Old Boy is a masterpiece, Sympathy for Mr. Vengeance is pretty damn close to being just as good. It's maybe a little slower, maybe drags a bit, especially for a movie where you're gonna have to read subtitles, but I'm talking like a little bit compared to Old Boy. This is an amazing thriller that has stunning cinematography in it, but it also just has these like macabre twists and turns that are surprising. You don't see any of this stuff coming because The story here is coming from a very different place. It's not deriving itself from a dozen other movies you've seen before. It's a really unique revenge flick that also takes a look at revenge in a pretty unique way. And then for my number 3 pick, I'm actually happy to say that this movie eventually found an audience and has become itself a cult classic, even though it bombed at the box office, critics didn't like it, yours truly loved it. The Way of the Gun.
Some deep pockets, a pregnant woman, some bodyguards, and a doctor's name.
Now this too is like a modern Western, but you've got Ryan Phillippe and Benicio del Toro both being absolute badasses in this movie. Taye Diggs is awesome in this flick. Juliette Lewis, James Caan, they're all awesome and they're all doing very unusual things. Like for a modern day Western, you know, there's no horses. So seeing how bandits might use cars, I'm gonna say too much with this movie, but it's got a lot of clever getaway and escape sequences in it. So much so that the director, Chris McQuarrie, would actually go on to do the last handful of Mission Impossible movies, which are among some of the best ever made. This movie has a much smaller budget than Mission Impossible movies, but you can see that the action sequences are all very well thought out and choreographed, culminating in one of the greatest shootouts, not just on this list, but like one of my favorite shootouts in movie history is in this movie. It's amazing stuff. This is a true Darren Van Dam gem. If you typically like my recommendations and you've never seen this one, you're in luck. Definitely watch it on Tubi. I don't care if you don't like commercials. You're gonna love this flick. Fair warning, the movie pops off from the very beginning. You're gonna hear more obscenities in the first 30 seconds of this movie than you're gonna hear in almost anything else on this list in its entirety. If you've seen the movie, you know what I'm talking about. And then my number 2 pick is a movie with barely any obscenities in it at all, The World's Fastest Indian, starring Anthony Hopkins. Now, I just recently rewatched this movie. It's a longtime favorite of mine, and it's a road movie. This is actually based on a true story of a man named Burt Munro, who was from New Zealand, and his dream in his old age was to go to Bonneville in the US and race his modified Indian motorcycle on the Salt Flats. So The World's Fastest Indian actually turns into a road movie. It's his journey to America and then all the struggles he has to fulfill his dream. He's actually kind of a squirrely character, and Anthony Hopkins, he is easily one of the greatest actors to have ever lived. You know, like, it looks like Anthony Hopkins, he's very famous, you've seen him a bunch of times, but the subtleties of his performance, you feel like you're watching this crazy old man with a weird dream. It's really magical, and even though it's got a lot of intense sequences with a lot of speed and ultimately is almost like a sports movie towards the end, the Burt Munro character is what makes this movie so endearing. He almost seems like the worst neighbor you could possibly have from the start.
What the hell are you doing this time? Oh, like you said, George, I'm getting rid of the grass. Being a good neighbor before I leave tomorrow.
But you realize he rubs everyone the wrong way initially and then wins everybody over that he comes into contact with. It's actually a really beautiful story and just highly rewatchable. Now, remember earlier when I mentioned Nicholas Winding Refn's Drive? Well, my number 1 pick, it's not Drive, but it's a movie from 1967 that definitely inspired Drive and a bunch of other revenge flicks like it, Point Blank. Now, in this movie, Lee Marvin plays a man named Walker, but these are actually based on the Parker books. Jason Statham played Parker once, and Mel Gibson played Porter in Payback. It's based on the same character here. He's a criminal who's left for dead after a heist, and when he shows back up in LA, he's not only out for revenge, he's out for his money. But I cannot stress how cool this movie is. And I mean cool in the traditional sense. Like, Lee Marvin's character is this really cool, calm, collected guy, but the way that they filmed the movie also has these like 1967 psychedelic elements to it. A cool, calm score, a lot of the locations that they film in are just really, I mean, I don't know how else to put it. It's a really cool flick. I think for a movie from 1967, you'll be surprised how badass it actually is. If you love Payback with Mel Gibson and you've somehow never seen Point Blank, it needs to be the first movie you watch off of this list. Trust me, you're going to be pleasantly surprised by this one. But that is the list. Don't forget to go check out the Sundays link in the video description. If you've got a dog, it's a great way to take care of them. But I will keep making these videos as long as y'all keep watching them. Thanks for checking out this special Tubi episode, and you will see me on the next one.